We think we know the Middle Ages. We see castles, knights, and religious paintings. We think of it as a dark time, a simple time, but we are wrong. The art they left behind is not simple. It is a language, and we have forgotten how to read it. Why do their paintings look so flat and strange? Why are their knights fighting giant snails in the margins of their Bibles? Why was a certain shade of blue more expensive than gold? These are not mistakes. They are clues. Each strange detail, each odd choice is a secret message from a world that thought differently than we do. A world where a picture was not just a picture, it was a map of the universe. It was a prayer. It was a political statement. It was a joke. To look at medieval art is to look through a keyhole into a room we thought was empty. But it is not empty. It is filled with ideas and fears and beliefs we can barely imagine. Are we willing to look closer? Are we ready to see what is hidden in plain sight? Well, number 15, why was blue more valuable than gold? You look at a painting of the Virgin Mary. Her robe is a deep, brilliant blue. It is beautiful. But you probably do not think about the color itself. For a medieval person, that blue was not just a color, it was a statement. It was a symbol of wealth, power, and holiness all at once. And it often cost more than the gold leaf shimmering right next to it. The color was called ultramarine. The name means from over the sea, and that is exactly where it came from. The pigment was made from a semi-precious stone called lapis lazuli. For centuries, the only known source for the highest quality lapis lazuli was a single set of mines in a remote, dangerous valley in what is now northeastern Afghanistan. The Sar-Isang mine district has been worked for over 6,000 years. To get that stone to a painter's workshop in Paris or Florence was an incredible journey. It traveled by donkey, by camel, by boat. It crossed mountains and deserts. It passed through the hands of countless merchants, each one taking a cut. By the time the raw stone arrived in Europe, it was already incredibly expensive. But the work was not done. Turning the stone into pigment was a long and difficult process. The artist's apprentice would grind the lapis lazuli into a fine powder. Then they would mix this powder with melted wax, resins, and oils to form a kind of putty or dough. This dough was kneaded repeatedly in a lye solution over several days. The purest blue particles would sink to the bottom of the container, while impurities and lower-grade blue would be washed away. Only the very finest, most intense blue was kept for the most important parts of a painting. Sannino Sannini, an Italian painter, wrote a handbook for artists in the late 14th century called Il Libro dell'Arte, the Craftsman's Handbook. He describes the process in detail. He calls ultramarine a glorious, lovely, and absolutely perfect pigment, beyond all the other pigments. He also warns that it is expensive. He suggests artists should be careful not to be cheated when buying it. And he notes that even if you could afford it, many patrons would specify in their contracts exactly how much ultramarine the artist was allowed to use. It was reserved for the robes of Christ and the Virgin Mary. To paint a lesser figure in ultramarine would be a kind of blasphemy. It would be a waste of a holy substance. Think about what this meant. The value was not just monetary. It became theological. The color of heaven, the color of the Queen of Heaven, was literally the most precious substance in the studio. It was a physical manifestation of divine value. When a medieval person saw that color, they saw the cost. They saw the journey, and they saw the sacred. It was a color that demanded reverence. Other blues existed. Azurite was a cheaper alternative, mined in Europe, but it could turn green over time and lack the deep, vibrant quality of true ultramarine. It was the difference between a local stone and a jewel from the ends of the earth. This intense focus on the material itself is something we have lost. We think of paint as something that comes in a tube. We think of color as a choice based on aesthetics. For them, the material was part of the meaning. The gold leaf in a halo was not just yellow paint, it was actual gold, beaten into a sheet so thin it could float on a breath. It was the metal of kings and of the divine. The red might come from a crushed insect, kermes, which took thousands of tiny bodies to make a small amount of pigment. Each color had a story, a cost, a labor. The Wilton diptych, a small portable altarpiece made in the late 1390s for King Richard II of England, is a perfect example. The robes of the Virgin and the angels are a sea of ultramarine. The cost of the pigment used on that one small panel would have been astronomical. It was a public declaration of the king's piety and his wealth. It showed he would spare no expense to honor God. And it showed everyone else that he could afford to. So when we look at that blue, we are not just seeing a color choice. We are seeing a global trade network. We are seeing a complex chemical process. We are seeing a system of economic and religious values all compressed into a single pigment. It tells us about a world where the physical substance of art was as meaningful as the image it created. But what parts of this story are we still missing? Did the extreme cost of the pigment help create its religious significance, or did the religious significance drive people to seek out such an expensive material? What other common materials in their world had deep symbolic meanings that are now completely invisible to us? And could a common person looking at a painting in a church truly tell the difference between real ultramarine and a cheaper blue, or was the knowledge of its cost reserved for the elite patrons and artists? Number 14. Who put snails in the margins? Turn the page of a medieval manuscript. In the center, you will see beautiful calligraphy. The Word of God, a history, a poem. It is serious, it is ordered, but look to the edges. Look in the margins, and that is where the world gets weird. You might find a monkey playing the bagpipes. You might find a woman riding a giant chicken. You might find a nun picking fruit from a penis tree. And you will definitely find knights fighting snails. It is one of the most common and most baffling images in the margins of 13th and 14th century Gothic manuscripts. A fully armored knight with sword and shield in a life or death struggle with a common garden snail. The snail is often depicted as large and menacing, but it is still just a snail. The knight is often shown cowering or losing the battle, like what on earth is going on here? This art in the margins is called marginalia. For a long time, historians did not pay much attention to it. They saw it as decoration, doodling by bored monks. But in recent decades, scholars have started to take it seriously. They believe these strange images are not random. They are a window into the medieval mind. And the snail is one of the biggest mysteries. There are many theories. One of the most popular comes from the art historian Lillian Randall. In her 1962 article, The Snail in Gothic Marginal Warfare, she suggested the snail was a symbol for the Lombards. The Lombards were a group of people from northern Italy who became known in the Middle Ages as powerful and often unpopular bankers and moneylenders. They were stereotyped as being cowardly and non-martial, despite their wealth and influence. So, the image of a heavily armed knight fighting a cowardly but well-armored snail with its shell could have been a popular joke or a form of social satire. It was a way for the French or English aristocracy, who were often in debt to the Lombards, to poke fun at their creditors. Another theory, proposed by art historian Michael Camille in his book Image on the Edge, The Margins of Medieval Art, is that it is a commentary on social climbers. The snail, which carries its home on its back and appears out of nowhere, could represent the non-aristocratic class trying to rise above their station. The knight, representing the established social order, is there to put the snail back in its place. It is a visual representation of class anxiety. But the theories get stranger. Some think it is a more general symbol of cowardice. The knight is fighting an easy, non-threatening target. It is a parody of chivalry. Here are these great heroes who are supposed to be fighting dragons and rescuing damsels, and what are they actually doing? They are fighting snails. It is a joke about the gap between the ideal of knighthood and the reality. It could also be about death and resurrection. The snail goes into its shell and seems to be dead, only to emerge again. In a world deeply concerned with the resurrection, this could be a small, everyday symbol of that promise. And then there is the simplest explanation. Maybe it was just funny. Monks and scribes spent long, tedious hours copying text by hand. The margins were the one place they had some freedom. It was a space to play, to complain, to be irreverent. The image of a powerful knight being threatened by a slimy snail is just absurd. It is a good visual punchline. The humor of the Middle Ages was often earthy, strange, and full of unexpected juxtapositions. We see it in the stories of Chaucer and the plays performed in town squares. The marginalia might just be the visual equivalent of that. These images are found in some of the most beautiful and expensive books of the time, like the Luttrell Psalter made in England around 1325 to 1340, or the Gorleston Psalter. These were not cheap, disposable objects. They were commissioned by wealthy patrons. This means the patron and the artist both knew about and approved of these bizarre marginal doodles. They were part of the package, they were meant to be there. The marginalia shows us a side of the medieval world that is often invisible in the official art. It is a world with a sense of humor, a world of social commentary, a world of anxieties and private jokes. It reminds us that these were not just pious, serious people. They were also bored, funny, and sometimes very, very strange. The margins were their internet forum, their meme page. It was where the unofficial conversation was happening. But so much remains a mystery. If the snail was a symbol for the Lombards, why does it appear in so many different contexts, even in books with no obvious connection to finance? Could these images have multiple meanings at once, depending on who was looking at them? And what about all the other bizarre marginalia, the butt trumpets, the rabbit armies, the three-headed monsters? Are we just guessing at their meaning, imposing our own logic on a world that operated with a completely different set of symbols? Number 13, why does everyone look so flat? One of the first things you notice about a lot of medieval art is that it looks wrong. The people are flat, the perspective is off, a king might be 3 times bigger than the building he is standing next to. A baby Jesus might look like a miniature old man. For centuries, people looked at this and thought they just did not know how to draw. The common story is that the ancient Romans were good at art, then the Middle Ages happened and everyone forgot, and then the Renaissance came and they relearned it. This story is completely wrong. Medieval artists were not bad at drawing, they were just playing a different game. They had a different goal. Their goal was not to create a realistic snapshot of the world. Their goal was to convey meaning, to tell a story, and to represent a divine truth. Realism was not just unimportant, it was often a distraction. Think about it this way. To a medieval Christian artist, the world you see with your eyes is temporary. It is a shadow. The real world, the important world, is the spiritual world. The world of God, angels, and saints. How do you paint a soul? How do you paint holiness? You cannot do it with realistic perspective and shading, so they developed a different visual language. This language was based on symbols and hierarchy. It is called hieratic scale. The most important person in the picture is the biggest. In a painting of the Madonna and Child with a donor, the person who paid for the painting, Mary, will be huge. So Jesus will be large. The donor, kneeling in the corner, will be tiny. This is not because the donor was a very small person. It is because, in the spiritual order of things, he is less important than God. Size equals significance. It is a simple, powerful way to show you what matters. The flatness also served a purpose. A flat, golden background does not look like a real place. And that is the point. The scene is not happening in your backyard. It is happening in a divine space outside of time and place. The gold is not a yellow wall. It is the light of heaven. By removing realistic depth, the artist lifts the scene out of the everyday world and into the spiritual realm. The figures become icons, not portraits. They are meant to be looked through, not at. They are a window into the sacred. And what about the strange-looking faces? The elongated figures, the big, staring eyes. This style was heavily influenced by Byzantine art from the Eastern Roman Empire. The goal was to create a sense of awe and spiritual intensity. The figures are not meant to look like your neighbor. They are meant to look holy, otherworldly. They are serene, solemn, and remote. They are not caught in a moment of fleeting emotion. They exist in an eternal state of grace. The idea that they could not do realism is easily proven wrong. You can find examples of very realistic-looking animals or small details in the margins of manuscripts right next to flat, symbolic religious figures. The artists could draw realistically when they wanted to. They just did not want to when depicting a sacred story. It was a conscious choice. The art historian Erwin Panofsky wrote extensively about this, explaining that medieval art was governed by a symbolic mode of thinking that is alien to our modern scientific worldview. A slow shift began in the late Middle Ages. Artists like Giotto, working in Italy around the year 1300, started to introduce more naturalism. His figures have weight, they stand on solid ground, they have emotional expressions. But even Giotto was not aiming for perfect realism. He was trying to make the sacred stories more human, more relatable. He was a bridge between the symbolic world of the Middle Ages and the human-centered world of the Renaissance. But for most of the medieval period, the symbolic approach was dominant. It was not a failure of skill. It was a triumph of a different kind of vision. So when you look at a flat medieval painting, do not ask, is it realistic? Ask, What is it trying to tell me? What is big? What is small? What is the background made of? Who is looking at me? The answers to those questions will tell you far more than perfect perspective ever could. But there are still questions we cannot answer. Did the average medieval person understand this complex visual language instinctively the way we understand a movie today? Or was it something only the educated elite could fully decode? And if they chose to abandon realism, what specific aspects of the physical world did they believe were the most dangerous or distracting to the soul? Whatever they fear a truly realistic painting might do to the viewer. Number 12. Did artists ever sign their work? We have a modern obsession with the artist as a celebrity. We know about Picasso, Monet, Warhol. Their names are as famous as their paintings. We think of art as an expression of individual genius. When we look at the Middle Ages, we have the opposite impression. The art seems anonymous. We talk about Chartres Cathedral or the Lindisfarne Gospels, but we rarely name the person who made them. This has led to the romantic idea of the humble medieval craftsman, working for the glory of God alone, without any desire for personal recognition. This idea is mostly a myth. While it is true that most medieval art is unsigned, there were artists who absolutely signed their work. And when they did, it was a bold and significant act. They were not just humble craftsmen. They were masters, proud of their skill, and they wanted God, their patron, and posterity to know it. One of the most famous examples is a sculptor named Gislebertus. Around the year 1130, he carved the stunning sculptures for the Cathedral of Saint Lazare in Autun, France. On the tympanum, the huge semicircular sculpture above the main entrance, there is a dramatic scene of the Last Judgment. And right underneath the feet of Christ, in a spot no one could miss, is an inscription Gislebertus hoc fecit. Gislebertus made this. This was not a quiet little signature tucked away in a corner. It was a prominent declaration of authorship, right, in the center of the most important piece of sculpture in the entire church. Gislebertus was claiming this masterpiece as his own. You know, he was an individual, a named master, not an anonymous stonecutter. His style is so distinctive that art historians have been able to identify his work in other parts of the cathedral. He was not just a pair of hands, he was a creative mind. We also have names of manuscript illuminators. In the 10th century, a nun in a Spanish monastery named Endeco illuminated a manuscript called the Girona Beatus. O Colophon, a note at the end of the book, names her and the scribe senior. It calls Ende de Aya Dutrix et Pinctrix, helper of God and painter. She is the first female artist in Spain whose name has come down to us. She was not content to remain anonymous. Another illuminator, Matthew Paris, a monk at St. Albans Abbey in England in the 13th century, was not just an artist but also a historian. He wrote and illustrated his own chronicles. In several of his drawings, he included self-portraits or notes identifying himself as the artist. He saw no conflict between his monastic humility and his pride in his artistic and intellectual work. So, why are signed works the exception rather than the rule? There are a few reasons. First, art was often a collaborative effort. A cathedral or a large manuscript involved the whole workshop of people with different skills: masons, sculptors, painters, scribes, gilders. Who gets to sign it? Usually only the head of the workshop, the master, would have that right. Second, the concept of art for art's sake did not really exist. Art had a function. It was to teach, to inspire devotion, to glorify God or a patron. The message was often considered more important than the messenger. But the idea of individual fame was not entirely absent. Artists' reputations mattered. We know from documents that certain masters were sought after. They could travel from city to city, commanding high fees. Their name was their brand. The architect of Notre Dame in Paris, for example, was a celebrated figure in his time, even if his name is not carved over the door. The act of signing also seems to have been more common in certain periods and places. The Gislebertus example from the 12th century is part of a moment when the status of the artist was on the rise. We see it again in the late Middle Ages as the workshop system began to give way to the individual artists we associate with the Renaissance. The anonymous medieval artist is a caricature. It hides a more complex reality. It was a world where collaboration was the norm, but individual genius was recognized and at times celebrated. The artists who signed their work were pioneers. They were asserting their identity in a world that often prioritized the collective. They were saying, I made this, I am a creator, a partner with God, remember my name. But how many other signatures have we missed, hidden in plain sight? How many works were signed in ways we no longer recognize, perhaps through a small, repeated visual motif instead of a name? And was the act of signing a work seen by some as an unforgivable act of pride, a sin that could endanger the artist's soul even as it secured their earthly legacy? Number 11. Who was the Green Man? Step into almost any old church in Europe. Look closely at the carvings in the stone or wood, on the ceiling bosses, on the choir stalls. Among the saints and angels, you might see a strange and unsettling face. It is a human head, but it is made of leaves. Vines and branches sprout from its mouth, its nostrils, its ears. Sometimes it is calm and serene. Sometimes it is screaming in agony. This is the Green Man. He is one of the most enigmatic figures in all of medieval art. He is not in the Bible. He is not a Christian saint. He seems to be a visitor from another world, a pagan ghost in the Christian machine. And he is everywhere. There are thousands of him, from the grandest cathedrals like Chartres and Bamberg to the smallest parish churches in rural England. He was carved for centuries, from the Romanesque period right through the Gothic. So, what is he doing there? The truth is, nobody knows for sure. The name Green Man is actually quite modern. It was coined in 1939 by Lady Raglan in an article for the Folklore Journal. Before that, he was just called a foliate head. But the name stuck because it captures the figure's mysterious natural essence. One of the most common theories is that he is a leftover from pre-Christian pagan religions. He could be a symbol of nature, a fertility spirit, a Celtic Cernunnos, or a Roman Sylvanus. In this view, when Christianity spread across Europe, it did not completely wipe out the old beliefs. Instead, it absorbed them. The stonemasons, whose traditions may have stretched back to pagan times, kept carving this powerful symbol of nature's life force. They put him in the church as a way of connecting the new faith to the old powerful cycles of death and rebirth in the natural world. He represents the untamable, wild part of creation that exists even within the sacred space of the church. Another theory is that he is not pagan at all, but a Christian symbol. The branches coming from his mouth could represent the word of God spreading across the world. Or he could be a warning against lust and earthly desires. In some medieval stories, the punishment for lust was to have thorny branches grow from your mouth. The Green Man, in this interpretation, is a cautionary figure, a reminder of the sins of the flesh. His face, often in anguish, shows the pain that comes from giving in to temptation. He could also be a symbol of resurrection. Just as plants die back in winter and are reborn in spring, the Green Man represents the promise of eternal life through Christ. His leafy face is a sign of hope and renewal. This would make him a perfectly acceptable figure to have in a church. The problem is that he can be all of these things at once. He is sometimes cheerful, sometimes terrifying. He is sometimes a central figure, sometimes hidden in a dark corner. This variety suggests he may not have had one single fixed meaning. His meaning might have changed depending on the time, the place, and the person who carved him. He was a flexible symbol that could be adapted to different purposes. The historian Mike Harding, in his book A Little Book of the Green Man, has documented hundreds of examples across Europe. He shows how the style changes, but the core image remains the same, the fusion of human and plant. It is a powerful, primal image that speaks to something deep in our connection to the natural world. The Green Man's popularity waned after the Renaissance and the Reformation. The new, more rational and less superstitious forms of Christianity had little room for such an ambiguous and earthy figure. He was seen as a relic of a primitive past, but he never completely vanished. He kept appearing in folk traditions and pub signs and in literature. He reminds us that medieval Christianity was not a monolith. It was a complex tapestry of official doctrine, local folklore, and ancient memory. The church was not a sterile intellectual space. It was a living, breathing place where the sacred and the profane, the Christian and the pagan could exist side by side. The Green Man is the ultimate symbol of that syncretism. He is the wildness that could not be fully tamed. And we are still left with so many questions. Were there specific guilds of stonemasons who were responsible for spreading the image of the Green Man across Europe? Was there a secret oral tradition that explained his meaning, a tradition that has now been completely lost? Or is his power precisely in his ambiguity, the fact that he cannot be pinned down, allowing every generation to see in his leafy face a reflection of its own hopes and fears about humanity's place in the natural world? Number 10, Why did they think pelicans fed their young with blood? Imagine you are a medieval person walking into a church. You cannot read. The Bible is in Latin, a language you do not speak. The priest's sermon is the main source of your religious education. But all around you, on the walls, in the stained glass, in the carvings, is another form of teaching the art. And this art is full of animals, lions, eagles, unicorns, pelicans. But these are not just animals. They are symbols. The entire natural world was seen as a book written by God, full of moral and spiritual lessons. This way of thinking was recorded in books called bestiaries. A bestiary was a collection of descriptions of animals, both real and imaginary. Each description was followed by a moral or allegorical lesson. These books were incredibly popular in the Middle Ages, especially in England and France from the 12th to the 14th century. They were not scientific textbooks, they were guides to understanding God's plan through his creation. The information in them was often based on ancient sources like the Greek physiologus, not on direct observation. And this led to some very strange ideas about how animals behaved. Take the pelican. The medieval bestiary tells us that the pelican is an incredibly devoted parent. But its young, as they grow, become rebellious and strike their parents in the face. In anger, the mother pelican kills them. After 3 days, she is filled with remorse. She pierces her own breast with her beak and pours her blood over her dead chicks. The blood miraculously brings them back to life. Of course, this is not what real pelicans do. But for a medieval Christian, the story was a perfect allegory for Christ. Christ, like the pelican, gave his own blood to save humanity, his rebellious children. The 3 days the chicks are dead mirrors the 3 days Christ spent in the tomb. The pelican became a powerful symbol of Christ's sacrifice and resurrection. So, when you saw a pelican carved on a church lectern or embroidered on a priest's vestment, you were not just seeing a bird. You were seeing a sermon in symbol form. It was a reminder of the central mystery of the Christian faith. The image is known as the pelican and her piety, or consider the lion. The bestiary says the lion has 3 natures. First, it erases its tracks with its tail, just as Christ concealed his divine nature when he became human. Second, it sleeps with its eyes open, just as Christ's body slept on the cross, but his divine nature remained awake. Third, a lion cub is born dead. After 3 days, the father lion breathes in its face and brings it to life, just as God the Father resurrected Christ after 3 days. Again, a simple animal becomes a complex theological symbol. And then there were the fantasy creatures. The unicorn could only be captured if a virgin was sent into the forest. The gentle creature would come and lay its head in her lap, and then the hunters could catch it. This became an allegory for the incarnation, with the unicorn representing Christ, the virgin representing the Virgin Mary, and the forest representing the fallen world. The single horn symbolized the unity of Christ and God the Father. This symbolic way of seeing the world is a huge part of what we miss when we look at medieval art. We see a pretty animal, they saw a story about salvation. This worldview is detailed by scholars like T.H. White, who translated a 12th century bestiary. He shows how every creature, from the eagle to the ant, was enlisted to teach a Christian lesson. The world was not a collection of random objects. It was a coherent, meaningful text, and everything in it pointed towards God. This means that a lot of medieval art that looks purely decorative to us was actually didactic. It was meant to teach. The arrangement of animals, their poses, their interactions, all of it could be read by a person who knew the symbolic language of the bestiary. It was a visual literacy that has been almost entirely lost. We have become literal-minded. They were symbolic-minded. But the bestiary also raises some difficult questions. Did the people who wrote and read these books actually believe a pelican fed its young with blood, or did they understand it was just a story, a useful allegory? How do they reconcile the stories in the bestiary with their own observations of real animals? And what happens to faith when it is built on a foundation of facts about the natural world that turn out to be completely untrue? Did the eventual rise of scientific observation contribute to a crisis of faith by showing that God's book of nature was not what they thought it was? Number 9. What did the skeletons want? Sometime around the year 1424, a massive painting was put on the wall of the Cemetery of the Holy Innocents in Paris. It stretched for over 30 meters. It showed a procession of figures from the Pope and the Emperor down to the peasant and the child. but between each living person was a dancing, grinning skeleton. The skeletons were leading the living in a final, grim dance. This was the Danse Macabre, the Dance of Death, and it was an obsession that swept across late medieval Europe. The image was terrifying, but the message was simple. Death comes for everyone. It does not matter if you are rich or poor, powerful or weak. In the end, we all dance with the skeleton. This was not a new idea, but it took on a new urgency and a new visual form in the wake of the Black Death. The plague, which first hit Europe in 1347, killed an estimated 30 to 50% of the population. It was a trauma on an unimaginable scale. People saw death everywhere. It was sudden, random, and horrifying. The art that followed this catastrophe was profoundly changed. The Danse Macabre was one of the most powerful expressions of this new darker sensibility. The original painting in Paris is now gone, but its fame spread through woodcut prints. The artist Hans Holbein the Younger created a famous series of prints on the theme in the 1520s. The image became a staple of late medieval art, appearing in murals, manuscript illuminations, and printed books. The Danse Macabre was not just about the inevitability of death, it was also a form of social satire. In the dance, all the hierarchies that govern medieval life are erased. The skeleton mocks the king's crown and the bishop's mitre. It was a radical statement of equality in a world that was rigidly hierarchical. It reminded the powerful that their earthly status was temporary and meaningless in the face of divine judgment. Another related theme that became popular was the three living and the three dead. This story tells of three young noblemen out hunting. They suddenly encounter three walking corpses in various states of decay. The corpses speak to them saying, "As you are, we once were. As we are, you will be." It was a stark memento mori, a reminder of mortality. The goal was to shock the viewer out of their complacency and pride, and to encourage them to live a good life, to be prepared for judgment. We also see the rise of the transient tomb. Before the Black Death, tombs of nobles and bishops often featured a serene, idealized effigy of the deceased. In the late 14th and 15th centuries, a new type of tomb appeared. It had two levels. On the top was the traditional effigy, showing the person in all their glory. But below, visible to the viewer, was a second sculpture showing their body as a decaying corpse, often being eaten by worms and snakes. The tomb of Cardinal Jean de Lagrange, made in 1402, is a famous example. It is a graphic and horrifying depiction of the reality of death. This art is often called macabre, but to the people who made it, it was not about being morbid for its own sake. It was about telling the truth. In a world of sudden death, you had to be ready. This art was a spiritual tool. It was meant to scare you into salvation. The historian Johann Huizinga, in his classic book, The Waning of the Middle Ages, argued that the late medieval period was characterized by a violent and pessimistic worldview, a deep-seated fear of death and decay. This art is a direct reflection of that. It shows us a world grappling with a level of death that we can barely comprehend. It is the art of a post-apocalyptic society, a society that had seen its foundations shaken to the core. They were trying to make sense of a world where life was fragile and seemingly random. The skeletons were not just monsters, they were messengers, delivering a hard but necessary truth. But what did this constant exposure to images of death do to the medieval psyche? Did it make them more pious, as intended, or did it lead to a kind of fatalism and despair? And in Age Plagues, was the image of a dancing skeleton leading you away a pure terror, or could it also have been seen as a strange kind of release, a final end to the suffering of earthly life? Was there a comfort in the idea that even the most powerful and cruel tyrant would eventually have to take the skeleton's hand? Number 8, where were all the women artists? The story of art history, as it has traditionally been told, is a story of men. We learn about Giotto, Jan van Eyck, Gisela. The assumption has often been that in the rigidly patriarchal society of the Middle Ages, women simply were not artists. They were patrons, they were subjects, but they were not the creators. This assumption is wrong. There were women artists in the Middle Ages. The problem is that their stories have been lost, ignored, or deliberately erased. Finding these women is hard work. They often did not sign their work. They were usually excluded from the official guilds that controlled the art trade in the late Middle Ages. And the work they specialized in, like embroidery or manuscript illumination, was often classified as craft rather than high art by later generations of male historians. But they were there, and we are starting to rediscover them. One of the earliest we know by name is Ende, the nun who co-illustrated the Girona Beatus in Spain in the 10th century. Her signature, calling herself painter and helper of God, is a powerful assertion of her role as a creator. She was working within a convent, which was one of the few places a woman could receive an education and pursue intellectual and artistic work without the pressures of marriage and childbearing. Perhaps the most famous female creator of the Middle Ages was Hildegard of Bingen, a German abbess who lived in the 12th century. She was a true polymath, a writer, a composer, a philosopher, a mystic, and a visionary. She oversaw the creation of 2 manuscripts that recorded her mystical visions, including the Scivias. While she probably did not draw the illuminations herself, they were created under her direct supervision and are a direct visual translation of her unique and powerful visions. She was the artistic director, the mind behind the images. Her work shows a woman of immense creative and intellectual power, a major figure in her time. We also know of women working as professional artists outside the convent. In Paris, in the late 13th and early 14th centuries, the manuscript trade was booming. City records show a number of women, like a certain Anastasia, who were highly regarded professional illuminators. The writer Christine de Pizan, in her City of Ladies, c. 1405, praises Anastasia as one of the finest illuminators of her time, skilled in painting delicate borders and landscape backgrounds. These were not amateurs, they were professionals running businesses and supporting themselves with their art. Textile art was another area where women dominated. The famous Bayeux tapestry, which depicts the Norman conquest of 1066, was almost certainly designed and embroidered by women. While we do not know their names, this massive and complex work of narrative art is a testament to their skill and artistry. Embroidery, or opus Anglicanum English work, was a highly prized art form across Europe, and English women were its acknowledged masters. These were not just decorative wall hangings, they were valuable, high-status objects, often more expensive than paintings. So why have we forgotten them? Part of the problem is the way history is written. When a work is unsigned, we tend to assume the artist was male. When work was produced in a workshop, we remember the male master's name, not the names of the men and women who worked for him. And the distinction between art and craft has historically devalued the very media in which women were most active. The rediscovery of medieval women artists is a relatively recent project, pushed forward by feminist art historians like Whitney Chadwick and Dorothy Miner. They have scoured archives, re-examined documents, and looked at the art itself for clues. They are piecing together a new history, one that includes the voices and visions of women. This revised history does not just add a few names to a list, it changes our whole picture of the medieval world. It shows us that women were not just passive objects of devotion or chivalry. They were active participants in the cultural life of their time. They were creators, innovators, and business owners. Their world was more complex and more interesting than the old male-centered histories would have us believe. But huge gaps in our knowledge remain. For every Ende or Anastasia, how many hundreds or thousands of women artists are there whose names are lost forever? Whether female sculptors or architects whose work has been misattributed to men. And what would a history of medieval art look like if we put the work of women like textiles and manuscript illumination at the center of the story, instead of treating it as a marginal activity? Number 7, why are there naked women carved on churches? On the walls of old churches, particularly in Ireland, the UK, France, and Spain, you might find a shocking and unexpected figure. It is a carving of a woman, usually old and haggard. She is naked, and she is holding her own vulva open, displaying it for all to see. This is the Sheila Nagig. She is a deeply unsettling figure. She does not fit with our ideas of pious, serene religious art. She is grotesque, explicit, and confrontational. For centuries, she was ignored or even destroyed by Victorians who found her obscene. But she is a persistent feature of Romanesque churches, built roughly from the 11th to the 13th century. There are over 100 examples in Ireland alone. Who is she and what is she doing on the house of God? This is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries of medieval art. There are 3 main theories, and scholars are deeply divided. The first theory is that she is a warning against lust. In this interpretation, the Sheila Nagig is a physical representation of the evils of female sexuality. Her ugly, non-erotic appearance is meant to repel, not attract. She is a horrific symbol of the sin that leads men to damnation. Placing her over a church doorway or window would be a stark reminder to those entering to leave their worldly sins behind. The Church Fathers wrote extensively about the temptations of the flesh and the dangers of women. The Sheila Nagig could be a stone sermon on that very topic. The second theory is the exact opposite. It suggests that she is a pre-Christian goddess figure, a symbol of fertility and life-giving power. In this view, she is related to ancient Celtic goddesses of sovereignty and creation. Her explicit display of her vulva is not a sinful act, but a sacred one. It is a display of the power of birth, the origin of all life. According to this theory, like the Green Man, she was absorbed into the Christian church from older pagan traditions. She was a powerful folk symbol that the people were not willing to give up. The church incorporated her to make the new religion more palatable, connecting it to the ancient sacred sites and beliefs. The third theory is perhaps the most intriguing. It suggests that the Sheila Nagig is an apotropaic figure. That means she is a protective symbol designed to ward off evil. In many cultures, the gesture of displaying the genitals is believed to have the power to avert the evil eye, to frighten away demons and bad luck. A demon approaching the church would be confronted by this powerful, terrifying female figure and would flee in terror. Her ugliness is her strength. She is a spiritual guardian, a sacred monster protecting the holy space. This idea is supported by the fact that Sheila Nagigs are often found over doors and windows, the vulnerable entry points of a building. The name Sheila Nagig itself is a mystery. It is an Irish phrase, and its meaning is not clear. It might mean the old hag of the breasts or the old woman on her hunkers. The name was first recorded in the 19th century, so we do not know what the people who carved her actually called her. Researchers like Jorgen Anderson in his book The Witch on the Wall and Eamon Kelly in Sheila Nagig's Origins and Functions have cataloged and studied these figures for decades. They trace her possible connections to figures in mainland Europe, but her concentration in Ireland and Britain remains unique. The Sheila Nagig challenges our assumptions about the Middle Ages. It shows us a world where the sacred could be grotesque, where sexuality could be a weapon against evil, and where the boundaries between Christian and pagan were blurry and fluid. She is a reminder that the medieval mind did not always think in the neat categories we try to impose on it. She is raw, powerful, and profoundly strange. She refuses to be easily explained, and the biggest questions remain. If she was a warning against lust, why does she appear on so many churches but is almost never mentioned in religious texts of the period? If she was a pagan goddess, why did the church, which was so intent on stamping out heresy, allow her to be displayed so prominently? And if she was a protector, what specific kind of evil were people so afraid of that they needed such a shocking and powerful guardian to keep it at bay? Was she all three things at once? Number 6, who paid for the painting? In many medieval and Renaissance paintings, you will see a strange thing. Right in the middle of a sacred scene like the crucifixion or the Annunciation, there are a few extra people who do not seem to belong. They are not saints or angels. They are dressed in the contemporary clothes of the 15th century. They are often kneeling, looking on with pious expressions. These are the donors. They are the people who paid for the painting, and putting themselves in the picture was one of the great power moves of the late Middle Ages. This is the art of the donor portrait. It became incredibly popular in the 14th and 15th centuries, especially in Northern Europe, with artists like Jan van Eyck and Rogier van der Weyden. At first glance, it seems like an act of piety. The donor is showing their devotion by commissioning a work of religious art. They are shown in a state of perpetual prayer, forever witnessing the sacred event. But it was much more than that. It was also a brilliant piece of social and political marketing. A donor portrait was a way to display your wealth, your status, and your piety all at the same time. These paintings were expensive. Commissioning a major altarpiece from a famous artist was a huge investment. By having yourself painted into it, you were creating a permanent public record of your generosity and your importance. The painting would hang in a church for everyone to see. Every time someone looked at that image of the Virgin Mary, they would also see you, the wealthy merchant or the powerful duke who made it all possible. It was a way to buy a little piece of immortality. Your name and your face would be associated with a holy image. It was also a way to secure prayers for your soul. Part of the deal was that people who saw the painting would be encouraged to pray for the soul of the donor. In a world where the fate of your soul after death was a constant, pressing concern, this was a very good investment. It was a spiritual insurance policy. A great example is the Madonna of Chancellor Roland by Jan van Eyck, painted around 1435. It shows Nicholas Roland, the powerful and wealthy chancellor of the Duke of Burgundy, kneeling opposite the Virgin Mary. There is no saint or angel introducing him. He is shown on the same level as the Queen of Heaven in the same room. The level of detail in his fur-lined robe and his stern, worldly face is just as intense as the detail on the infant Christ. This is an incredibly bold statement. Roland is not just a humble worshiper. He is a man of power and importance, worthy of a direct audience with the divine. The donor portrait also tells us about the changing social landscape of the late Middle Ages. The people commissioning these paintings were not just the old aristocracy and the high clergy anymore. They were increasingly from the newly rich merchant class. Bankers, cloth merchants, and traders were using art to legitimize their new status. They could not claim noble blood, but they could display their wealth and piety. A grand altarpiece in the local church was a way of translating economic power into social and spiritual capital. It was a way of saying, we have arrived. This practice seems strange to us. It is a bit like a modern billionaire insisting on being painted into a scene from the Bible. It feels arrogant, but for the late medieval mind, the line between the sacred and the secular was more permeable. They did not see it as a conflict to mix a personal memorial with a sacred image. It was a way of integrating their own lives into the grand story of salvation. This practice reveals a world in transition. The old corporate identity of the Middle Ages was giving way to a new focus on the individual. People wanted to be remembered, not just as a member of a guild or a family, but as a specific person with a specific face. The rise of the donor portrait is a sign of the rising tide of individualism that would blossom in the Renaissance. It shows us a society where money could buy you a place, not just in this world, but also, hopefully, in the next. But where did they draw the line? Was there a point at which a donor's presence in a painting was considered too arrogant, too self-aggrandizing, even for them? Did artists ever push back against patrons who wanted to be portrayed too prominently? And how did the common people who prayed before these images feel about having to look at the face of their rich and powerful landlord or banker every time they went to church to speak to God? Number 5, how is a cathedral a vision of heaven? A Gothic cathedral is not just a building, it is a machine for spiritual experience. When you walk into a great cathedral like Chartres or Notre Dame in Paris, you are meant to feel like you have left the ordinary world behind and stepped into a different reality. The sheer height, the soaring vaults, the streams of colored light, it was all designed to overwhelm your senses and lift your mind towards God. It was an attempt to build heaven on earth. This revolution in architecture began in the 12th century in France. A key figure was Abbot Suger, who rebuilt the Abbey Church of Saint-Denis near Paris around 1140. Suger was a man of power and a deep thinker. He was influenced by the theological writings of a figure known as Pseudo-Dionysius the Areopagite, who wrote that light was a manifestation of the divine. God is light. Therefore, a church should be filled with as much light as possible. This was a radical idea. The earlier Romanesque style of architecture was characterized by thick, heavy walls, small windows, and a feeling of solid, fortress-like strength. To fill a church with light, you needed to get rid of the walls, but how do you hold up a massive stone roof without thick walls? The Gothic builders developed a system of 3 key innovations to solve this problem. First was the pointed arch. Unlike the round Romanesque arch, the pointed arch directs the weight of the roof downwards more efficiently. This means the walls do not have to be as thick to support it. Second was the ribbed vault. By crisscrossing the ceiling with stone ribs, the builders could create a strong but relatively light skeleton for the roof, channeling the weight to specific points. The third and most crucial innovation was the flying buttress. This was the stroke of genius. The downward and outward pressure from the roof was now channeled through the ribs to piers inside the church. But that outward pressure still needed to be counteracted. The flying buttress is an external stone arm that leaps from the outside of the building to the pier, propping it up and taking all the outward thrust. This system of pointed arches, ribbed vaults, and flying buttresses created a stone skeleton. The walls in between the structural elements were no longer needed to hold the building up. They could be opened up and filled with vast windows of stained glass. And this is where Abbot Suger's vision was realized. The stone structure of the cathedral dissolved into a cage of light and color. The effect on a medieval person would have been overwhelming. Most people lived in small, dark, crowded wooden houses. To enter a space like this was to enter another world. The light filtered through the jewel-like colors of the stained glass was not ordinary light. It was, as Suger believed, divine light. It was meant to be a mystical experience, a foretaste of the heavenly Jerusalem, which the Bible describes as being built of precious stones and filled with the light of God. The stained glass windows were not just decoration, they were the Bible of the poor. They told the stories of the Old and New Testaments and the lives of the saints to a largely illiterate population. As the sun moved across the sky, different parts of the story would be illuminated, creating a slow cinematic narrative throughout the day. The height was also crucial. The soaring vaults drew the eyes upwards, away from the earth and towards the heavens. The complex geometry and mathematical precision of the building were seen as a reflection of the divine order of the universe. God was the great geometer, and the cathedral was a model of his perfect creation. The art historian Otto von Simpson, in his book The Gothic Cathedral, argued that these buildings were shaped by a desire to make theological principles visible in stone and light. So a cathedral was not just a container for worship, it was an active participant in it. The architecture, the light, the art, and the sound of the chanting and the organ all worked together to create a total sensory environment. It was designed to transport you, to change you, to give you a glimpse of the divine. It was a physical argument for the existence of God, written in stone and glass. But how did they build these incredible structures with only rudimentary technology? How did they lift massive stones hundreds of feet in the air with wooden cranes powered by men and hamster wheels? And what was the psychological effect of spending your entire life in the shadow of a building project that you knew you would never live to see completed? Did it foster a unique sense of community and long-term purpose that we have now lost? Number 4, what did they use for paint and paper? We look at a medieval illuminated manuscript like the Lindisfarne Gospels or the Book of Kells, and we see a work of art. But it is also a technological marvel. The materials used to create these objects were precious, labor-intensive, and sometimes bizarre. To understand the art, we have to understand the stuff it was made from. The material was part of the message. First, let's talk about the paper. It was not paper, it was vellum, made from the processed skin of an animal, usually a calf, sheep, or goat. Making vellum was a long, smelly, and difficult process. The animal's skin had to be soaked in a lime solution for days to loosen the hair, and then it was scraped clean with a special curved knife. After that, it was stretched tightly on a wooden frame to dry. As it dried, the scribe would continue to scrape it with a knife, making it thinner and smoother until it was a pale, creamy, durable writing surface. It took a huge number of animals to make a single book. The Lindisfarne Gospels, made around the year 700, required the skins of about 150 calves. A giant Bible could require the skins of 500 or more animals. A whole herd of livestock was walking around as a potential book. This meant that the vellum itself was incredibly valuable before a single word or image was put on it. A book was not just a container for information, it was a store of real wealth, as tangible as a plot of land or a herd of cattle. And then there was the ink and the paint. The ink for writing was usually made from one of two things. Iron gall ink was made from oak galls, the little round growths on oak trees caused by wasps, mixed with iron sulfate and a binder like gum arabic. Carbon black ink was made from soot mixed with a binder. Both were permanent and dark. The paints, or pigments, were where the real expense and artistry came in. These were not squeezed from a tube. Each color had to be made by hand from natural materials. We have already talked about the incredible cost of ultramarine blue from lapis lazuli. But other colors also had fascinating origins. Vibrant reds often came from two main sources. Vermilion was made from a toxic mineral called cinnabar mercury sulfide. It had to be ground up carefully. Another prized red, carmine, was made from the crushed bodies of tiny Kermes insects that lived on oak trees in the Mediterranean. It took thousands of insects to produce a small amount of pigment. Greens came from minerals like malachite or from verdigris, which was made by suspending copper plates over vinegar. The resulting chemical reaction created a beautiful but unstable green pigment that could sometimes eat through the vellum over time. Yellows could be made from a mineral called orpiment arsenic sulfide, which was highly toxic, or from a plant-based dye made from weld or saffron, which was incredibly expensive. To turn these ground-up powders into paint, they had to be mixed with a binder. The most common binder for manuscript illumination was glaire, which is made from egg whites beaten to a froth and then allowed to settle. For panel painting, the binder was egg yolk, creating a type of paint called egg tempera. This paint dried very quickly and had to be applied in thin, careful layers. It created a luminous, jewel-like surface, and of course, there was the gold. Gold leaf was used to represent divine light, heaven, or royalty. A gold beater would hammer a small piece of gold between layers of leather until it was an incredibly thin sheet, sometimes less than 1/250,000th of an inch thick. This delicate leaf was then applied to the vellum over a base of gesso, a mixture of plaster and glue or a sticky substance like gum. The gilder could then burnish it with a smooth, hard tool, like an animal's tooth, to make it shine brilliantly. When you look at a medieval manuscript, you are not just looking at a picture. You are looking at a collection of rare and precious materials from all over the world. You are seeing ground-up jewels from Afghanistan, crushed insects from the Mediterranean, toxic minerals from the earth, and the beaten gold of kings. The sheer effort and cost involved tell us how much they valued these objects. They were not just books, they were treasures created to honor God and to last for eternity. But how they developed this incredible knowledge of natural chemistry without modern scientific equipment? Was it purely trial and error, a craft tradition passed down through generations? And what other strange or precious materials did they experiment with that have not survived or that we have not yet identified through modern analysis? How many recipes for colors have been completely lost to time? Number 3, was this art meant to be propaganda? We often think of propaganda as a modern invention, something for political posters and state-controlled television. Propaganda is as old as power itself, and in the Middle Ages, one of the most powerful forms of propaganda was art. Kings, emperors, and popes understood that images could shape public opinion, legitimize their rule, and tell a story from their point of view. A lot of medieval art was not just about God, it was also about power. Perhaps the single greatest piece of medieval propaganda is the Bayeux Tapestry. First, it is not a tapestry, it is a massive embroidery nearly 70 meters long. It was made in the 1070s, just a few years after the events it depicts. It tells the story of the Norman conquest of England in 1066. But it tells that story from a very specific pro-Norman perspective. The central drama of the embroidery is an oath. It shows the English Earl, Harold Godwinson, swearing an oath of fealty to William, Duke of Normandy, over holy relics. Later, when Harold takes the throne of England for himself, the embroidery portrays him as a perjurer, a man who broke a sacred vow. This justifies William's invasion as a righteous quest to punish a sinner and claim his rightful throne. The English side of the story was, of course, very different. They argued that Harold was forced to swear the oath under duress, and that he was the legitimate choice of the English nobility. But the English did not have a 70-meter-long embroidery to tell their tale. The Bayeux Tapestry is a masterful piece of visual spin. It was likely commissioned by William the Conqueror's half-brother, Odo of Bayeux, and made by English embroiderers. It is a victor's history, designed to be displayed in a cathedral to a wide audience. It uses simple, powerful images to make a complex political argument seem like a clear-cut case of good versus evil. Rulers all over Europe used art in this way. Charlemagne, the great Frankish emperor crowned in the year 800, consciously used art and architecture to revive the glory of the Roman Empire. He had his palace chapel in Aachen, modeled on Roman and Byzantine churches. He promoted a style of manuscript illumination that copied the classical style. This was not just an aesthetic choice, it was a political statement. He was saying, I am the new Roman emperor. My rule is a continuation of that great ancient power. It was a way of legitimizing a new dynasty by wrapping it in the authority of the past. Art was also used in the power struggles between the church and the state. In the 11th and 12th centuries, there was a major conflict known as the investiture controversy between the popes and the Holy Roman emperors over who had the right to appoint bishops. Both sides used images to make their case. Pro-papal art would show the Pope as the supreme authority, receiving his power directly from Christ. Pro-imperial art would show the emperor being crowned by God, suggesting his power was also divinely ordained and not subject to the Pope's approval. These were not subtle images, they were political cartoons in the service of a power struggle. Even the way saints were depicted could have a political dimension. A king might promote the cult of a particular saint who was a royal ancestor. By commissioning paintings and churches dedicated to this royal saint, the king was reinforcing his own family's legitimacy and its special connection to God. The saint's holiness reflected onto the current ruler. This political use of art reminds us that the medieval world was not a static, unified age of faith. It was a place of constant political maneuvering, conflict, and competition. Rulers needed to justify their wars, their taxes, and their very right to rule. Art was a key weapon in their arsenal. It could create a heroic origin story for a dynasty, demonize an enemy, or project an image of divinely sanctioned power. So when we look at a medieval image of a king or an emperor, we should not just see a portrait. We should ask, who paid for this? Who was meant to see it? And what message was it trying to send? Often the answer is not just about piety. It is about power. But how effective was this propaganda? Did the average illiterate peasant looking at the Bayeux Tapestry really absorb its complex political message? Or did they just see a good story with lots of horses and fighting? Was there ever counter-propaganda art created by rebels or heretics to challenge the official narrative of the powerful? If such art existed, would it have been systematically destroyed, leaving us with only the victor's side of the story? Number 2. What did this art sound like? We experience medieval art in silence. We walk through museums and cathedrals in a quiet, reverent hush. We look at illuminated manuscripts in the silent reading rooms of libraries. We have trained ourselves to see this art as a purely visual experience. And in doing so, we are missing a huge piece of the puzzle. Medieval art was almost never experienced in silence. It was part of a rich, noisy, multisensory world. To understand the art, we need to try to hear its forgotten soundtrack. Think about a Gothic cathedral. We see the soaring arches and the stained glass, but imagine it on a feast day in the 13th century. The space would be filled with the sound of the choir chanting Gregorian chant. The complex, soaring melodies were designed to echo in the vast stone space, creating a soundscape that was as otherworldly as the architecture. The sound would seem to be coming from heaven itself. The priest would be intoning the Latin Mass, his voice rising and falling in a ritualized pattern. The great bell in the tower would ring out, marking the time and calling the community to prayer. The sound would vibrate through the very stones of the building. The space would also be filled with the sounds of people. The shuffle of feet on the stone floor, the coughs and cries of the congregation, the whispers of conversation. A church was not a silent sanctuary. It was the center of community life, a place of business and gossip as well as prayer. The art on the walls was the backdrop for all of this human noise. Or think about an illuminated manuscript. We see the delicate paintings, but this book was meant to be read aloud. A Bible or a psalter was a liturgical object. Its words were meant to be chanted or sung as part of a service. The visual beauty of the page, with its decorated initials and golden letters, was a counterpart to the oral beauty of the sung text. The art and the sound were meant to work together, to create a richer, more powerful experience of the sacred word. Even seemingly secular art had a soundtrack. The Bayeux Tapestry was likely displayed in a church, and a cleric would probably have stood beside it, pointing to the scenes and narrating the story in Latin or French for the crowd. The embroidery was a visual aid for a live performance. Music was everywhere in medieval life, and it was deeply intertwined with the visual arts. Processions were a common part of religious and civic life. A guild would process through the town with its banner, which was a work of art. The procession would be accompanied by music, by singing, by the ringing of bells. The art was mobile, and it had a soundtrack. This idea of a multi-sensory experience is a key focus of modern medieval studies. And scholars like Margot Fassler at the University of Notre Dame have done groundbreaking work on reconstructing the liturgical experiences of the Middle Ages. They study the music, the text, the art, and the architecture not as separate subjects, but as interconnected parts of a single performed event. They try to understand how all the senses of sight, sound, smell of incense, touch work together to shape the medieval religious imagination. This changes how we should approach the art. When we look at a sculpture of a saint, we should imagine the sound of a prayer being said to that saint. When we look at an altarpiece, we should imagine the sound of the Mass being celebrated in front of it. The art was not a static object on a wall, it was a participant in a living, breathing, noisy ritual. Losing the soundtrack means we have lost the context. We have turned a dynamic performance into a silent artifact. We have taken a character out of a play and put it in a display case. The silence of the modern museum is, in its own way, a distortion of history. It imposes our own ideas about how art should be experienced onto a past that had a very different understanding. The medieval world was loud, and its art was meant to be heard as well as seen. But can we ever truly reconstruct this lost soundscape? We can read the musical notation, but we do not know exactly how it was sung. We can stand in the cathedrals, but they are now filled with different noises, the sounds of tourism rather than worship. And what were the other sounds of the medieval world that formed the background to this art? The clang of the blacksmith's hammer, the cry of the street vendor, the creak of a wooden cart. How did this everyday noise shape the way they heard the sacred sounds inside the church? Number one, what if it was all a map? We have looked at the secrets of medieval art, the meaning of color, the weirdness in the margins, the purpose of flatness, the politics of a portrait. But what if there is one single secret that ties it all together? What if all the medieval art, from the smallest manuscript initial to the grandest cathedral, was part of a single vast project? What if it was all a map, not a map of the world, but a map of reality? The medieval mind did not see the world the way we do. We see a universe of matter and energy governed by physical laws. They saw a universe that was a divine creation saturated with meaning, purpose, and symbolism. Everything, a lion, a star, a color, a number, was a sign that pointed to a deeper spiritual truth. The universe was a book written by God, and they were learning how to read it. Their art was their textbook and their encyclopedia. It was their way of organizing all knowledge and all existence into a single coherent picture. Think of a Gothic cathedral. As we have seen, it was a vision of heaven, but it was also a microcosm of the entire universe. The floor plan was often a crucifix, the shape of the salvation story. The sculptures around the doors would depict the whole of human history, from the creation of Adam to the Last Judgment. The stained glass windows would show stories from the Bible, the lives of the saints, the labors of the months, and the signs of the zodiac. Even the plants carved into the capitals of the columns were often specific local species, bringing the natural worlds into the divine order. Walking through the cathedral was a journey through all of time and all of creation. It was a map of God's plan. A manuscript could be the same thing on a smaller scale. A Bible's opening page might show a diagram of the creation of the world in 6 days. A psalter might include a calendar marking the feast days that structured the year. The arrangement of images and text was not random. It was a carefully constructed model of a theological idea. This worldview is sometimes called the symbolic or allegorical worldview. The great Italian writer Umberto Eco wrote about it extensively in his book Art and Beauty in the Middle Ages. He explained that for medieval thinkers, beauty was not just about pleasing proportions or nice colors. All beauty was the reflection of a divine truth. A thing was beautiful because it participated in the order and harmony of God's creation. The job of the artist was not to invent something new, but to reveal the truth that was already there. The artist was a mapmaker of the invisible world. This is why the art can seem so strange and non-realistic to us. It was not mapping the surface of things, it was mapping the meaning behind things. Hieratic scale, where the most important figure is the biggest, makes perfect sense if you are drawing a map of spiritual importance rather than a picture of physical space. A flat golden background makes sense if you are mapping a location in the divine realm, not on Earth. The animals in a bestiary are not scientific illustrations. They are points on a moral map. This master secret that all of art was a map of reality is the key to unlocking the entire forgotten world. It explains why the material of the art was so important. The ultramarine and the gold were not just pretty, they were physical samples of the divine landscape they were trying to map. It explains why the art was so ordered and hierarchical. The universe was an ordered hierarchy and the map had to reflect the territory. When we look at medieval art today, we are like people who have found a detailed, complex map of a country that no longer exists. We can admire the draftsmanship and the colors, but we have lost the user's guide. We do not know what the symbols mean. We do not understand the scale. We do not know the purpose of the journey the map is supposed to guide us on. The secrets we have explored are all just ways of learning to read this map again. By understanding their symbols, their materials, their politics, and their sounds, we can begin to see the world through their eyes. We can begin to understand a mentality that saw the entire cosmos as a unified, meaningful, and beautiful work of divine art. And they, in turn, dedicated their own art to creating a faithful map of that cosmos, a guide for the soul on its journey through this life and into the next. But the final, most shocking question is this: what if they were right? What if the universe is not just a random collection of atoms, but is in fact saturated with a meaning and purpose that we have become blind to? Could looking at their art, their great map of reality, show us not just a forgotten world, but a forgotten way of seeing our own? And what other master keys to their worldview have we not even begun to look for, because we are so certain that our own modern map is the only accurate one?